Hello everybody, and welcome to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Craig Anderson. I'm a Kingston Writers Fest board member, and I'm very pleased to present Before Attica, the Kingston Pen's Forgotten Riot. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which the festival customarily takes place and where I stand is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So we hope you followed the sponsorship acknowledgement video that was playing before this event started. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival. I'd like to particularly thank the Toonie Book Club, who are the author patrons of Catherine Fogarty. Thank you. So this event is an hour long, and it does include a question and answer period. You'll see at the bottom there's a Q&A box, and so please put your questions in there. There's also a hand raising function, which is in reactions. So if you'd like to put your hand up to ask a question, then please do that. Or if you're joining us via the phone, *9 should do the same thing. As a thank you for continuing to support Kingston Writers Fest and joining us for the virtual edition of this festival, we will randomly be selecting a pre-registered participant of this event following the Q&A. And so we'll do this for every event throughout the festival. If you'd like to support the authors by picking up a copy of their books, our official bookseller is Novel Idea, and they have copies available to purchase in store, by phone, or online. Okay. Now I would like to introduce you to Catherine Fogarty. Catherine is the founder and president of Big Coat Media, with offices in Toronto, Los Angeles, Vancouver, and North Carolina. She's an accomplished television producer, writer, and director. Catherine has produced award-winning lifestyle reality and documentary series for both Canadian and American networks. In her book, Murder on the Inside, the true story of the Deadly Riot at Kingston Penitentiary, Catherine explores what was to become one of the most violent and devastating prison riots in our country's history. The Globe and Mail praised her balanced record of the riot and its inmates, depicting them in 3 dimensions: complicated, inconsistent, incomplete, flawed, but human beings who wanted and deserved better treatment. And Catherine's going to talk about the book a bit more now. I hope you're as excited as I am, so please let me hand you over to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's certainly an honor to be here. A few years ago, when I started writing the book, probably at the very beginning, I went up to the Kingston Writers Festival and had a wonderful time. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what, maybe one day I'll get back here as an author. So I think 5 short years later, here I am. So thank you very much for inviting me. And if you are from the Kingston area or the surrounding area, I think you'll obviously be very familiar with what we're going to be talking about today. The very famous Kingston Penitentiary. So what I thought I would do is I'm going to start with a quick reading, just to kind of get us into the penitentiary. This is the reading that I'm going to do is chapter 14 of the book. So this is on the last night of the riot. We're going to go to the end of the riot, and then we can go backwards from there. So here we go. Chapter 14, Circle of Terror. Saturday, April 17th, 1971. The fun is about to begin, yelled Dave Shepley from the upper tier of the rotunda. They needed to find the guard hostages and bring them to the dome. He wanted to put them on display, and if the army invaded, they would be the first ones killed. Shepley and his accomplices ran towards 4B range, where they knew the guards were being held. Wayne Ford, inmate number 2778, was 285 pounds with a 19-inch neck and a 57-inch chest. He had been put in charge of guarding the hostages, and he had no intentions of letting anyone near the guards. He knew they were the inmates' only potential insurance against a full-out military invasion. Wielding a sledgehammer, he and a dozen other armed inmates were prepared for battle. "Give us the pigs," demanded Shepley. "No way, pal," said a determined Ford, gripping his weapon tightly. The 5 kidnapped guards, locked in a cell further down the corridor, could hear the commotion. What was happening? They looked at each other, terrified, but no one dared to speak. Their jailers had treated them well so far, giving them sandwiches, coffee, and cigarettes, but the hostages knew their safety was hanging in the balance. If the army attacked the prison, they would be killed. The tense standoff over the guards continued as former prison buddies defiantly stared each other down. It was clear that Ford and the other inmates were not going to give up without a ferocious fight. Enraged, Shepley and his gang finally retreated. But if he couldn't get at the guards, he was going to turn all of his fury on another group, a weaker group. He was going hunting for the rats in 1D. Shepley and his men raced to the cell block where they knew they would find their targets. With all the commotion in the dome, the undesirables had been left unguarded. They dragged 13 inmates from 1D into the center of the dome. Some grabbed at their captors, whimpering and begging to be released. Others came quietly. All of the captured men were tied to straight-backed wooden chairs arranged in a circle. A metal chain was bound to their feet. At the center of the circle were the remains of the brass bell platform, now draped in a white sheet with candles and weapons on top of it. Acting as a macabre master of ceremonies, Shepley paced around the circle, eyeing each of the men. Rock music blasted over the loudspeakers strung around the dome. Gripping the bullhorn in his black-gloved hand, he addressed the hundreds of spectators hanging over the railings on the upper ranges. "What shall we do, gentlemen?" "Castrate them, cut their throats, kill them." The inmates pounded the metal railings in unison. "Do we know anyone else who should be here?" Shepley asked the wild-eyed audience. He knew there were more undesirables hiding in the cell blocks, and he wanted all of them, the diddlers and the finks, the hated dregs of the prison caste system. No one could hide from his rage. The 3 men cowering in the back of Harold St. Amour's cell up on the 3rd range could hear the uproar from the dome below. They knew they were in danger. Shepley's men would come for them. Ralph Lake, Melvin Travis, and Ron McCorkle scrambled to erect a barricade of overturned bed frames and other furniture. They hung bed sheets and blankets across the doorway, a sign for others to stay out of the cell. But the attackers quickly sniffed them out. Shepley's goons grabbed Travis and McCorkle right away. Lake made a run for it as Brian Bocage took after him. Lake raced through the crowded tiers, hoping to lose himself in the mass of gray prison uniforms and the maze of cells. He had to find another place to hide. But some of the other inmates quickly pointed him out to his pursuer. Bocage finally cornered him and dragged him down to the dome. I've been waiting 4.5 fucking years to get you, Bocage snarled at him. 16 men were now tied to the chairs in the sacrificial circle, surrounded by a dozen fellow inmates brandishing homemade weapons. Satisfied with his catch, Shepley motioned for the hair-raising, rhythmic pounding from above to cease. The multi-tiered rotunda grew quiet. The show is about to begin, he announced with an almost giddy laugh. So there we go. That was on the last night of the riot and the last few hours of the riot. So I thought now we would, I'll take you back and we'll go through a couple other. So I just want to make sure, I hope I've got you on here. Hope everyone can see that. Okay. Sorry, let me just go back. So Kingston Penitentiary in 1971, just as a little bit of a background, obviously it was Canada's oldest prison. It was built in 1835 by convict labor. It was notorious. It was and is our most famous prison in Canada. And there are so many stories out of Kingston Penitentiary because of its age. As many of you know, it was the penitentiary for everyone, women, children, men, and as I mentioned, it was built by convict labor. So it was a very, very harsh environment. If any of you have been to the penitentiary or the museum, there's so many things to see and so many artifacts from those early days, including the different types of punishment that were given out to many of the inmates. There were two previous riots that were in 1932 and 1954. But neither of those, both of them caused a considerable amount of damage, but there were no lives lost in either of those riots. And after each of the riots, there would always be, investigations and inquiries, but nothing really seemed to change. And time went on and the prison went on, and every decade there would be, different things going on. So I talk about that in the book, that there was very little change as the decades progressed inside Kingston Penitentiary. It was considered, I love this quote, this was from a journalist years ago who called it the toughest 10 acres in Canada. And it was the home of the lowest of the low. So at the time in 1971, there weren't the classification of prisoners that we have now in medium, minimum, medium, and maximum security. So at that time, everybody was in there together. So somebody who's stole a car, who was a petty thief, would be in prison next to a murderer. So that and that certainly had issues with what happened in the riot in April of 1971. So many of the men that I talk about in the book were just many of them were very young, and they were petty criminals. A lot of them had come from broken homes and had gone through foster care and group homes and things like that, and then just graduated up into the the big leagues, which was Kingston Penitentiary. At the time, April 1971, the prison was definitely overcrowded. There was over 640 some inmates in a prison that was really built to house maybe a maximum of 500. It was originally a penitentiary for 300, but then they kept adding to it and building on. as the years went on. So there was severe overcrowding and understaffing. And what's really interesting is the warden at the time, Arthur Jarvis. He knew that something was afoot. He knew there was problems in the penitentiary, and he had sent 2 letters to his superiors, one in November of 1970 and then again in January of 1971. And he said, literally, this place is about to blow. So unfortunately, his words came true, but unfortunately, nobody listened to him at the time. The other thing that was happening was the prison in 1971, if you can believe it, was going to be closed. Even 50 years ago, they said this building's archaic and out of date. So the new super maximum security prison called Millhaven that was built down the road, inmates were going to be transferred, and actually the day the riot began, the first group of inmates had been transferred. Now, this was a huge problem for the inmates sitting in Kingston Penitentiary, because they had heard all sorts of rumors about what was happening. What was that supermax like? Was it going to make things worse for them? So they were very nervous about what this new place was going to what this new place was going to mean to them. And I have to say that I think all of those fears were realized, unfortunately. So that's what was happening just prior to the riot. Who started the riot and what happened? So the riot was started by a small group of prisoners. The gentleman that you see there, his name is Billy Knight, and he was the man that instigated the riot with 6 others, small group of prisoners, and they had decided that they were going to overtake the guards at a time when they were coming out of the gymnasium. Groups of men, they would alternate every night as to how many prisoners would be allowed in the gymnasium to watch television. That night they were watching the hockey game. And so there was about 78 of them in the prison. And when they left, they would have to, go down these long corridors, and guards would be stationed. So it was very simple for them to overtake one of the guards, knock him down, and then proceed to keep going down that corridor and grabbing the other guards and the keys to all of the other areas in the prison. So it happened very, very quickly. And then at that point, they were basically in charge. 6 guards were kidnapped, and that was obviously very, very terrifying for everybody else that was on the outside of the prison at the time, and the other guards that were on duty, because they didn't know what was going to happen to their colleagues. When the guards were kidnapped, they were instantly hidden and put in prison uniforms, so they blended in, which was a very interesting thing to do. And then immediately, what the prisoners did is they decided that there would be a group that would protect those kidnapped guards, because they knew that they were their only insurance against an all-out military invasion. So they had to keep them safe. And I don't believe they ever intended on harming any of the guards. And that goes into my next point. Their intention was for this to be a non-violent protest. They were revolting against the very dehumanizing conditions in the prison at the time, the overcrowding, as I mentioned earlier, and of course that transfer to Millhaven. So as Billy Knight said, we want people to come in here. We want the world to come into the prison and see how the forgotten are treated. Come in, take a look, and talk to us and hear our grievances. At that time, there was also no grievance procedure for inmates. So there was nowhere where they could go to say, we have an issue with this problem. There was nobody to talk to. There was no committees. So they wanted to be heard. And as what the title of this session is about before Attica. So as we all know, 5 months later, in September of 1971, the exact same thing happened at Attica with much, much more devastating results. But the same issues were in place. Human rights, civil rights, and just asking to be heard. This was 1971, so it was a very different time, and people across the world and in North America and Canada were, these young men were starting to say, we want to be heard, and you've taken our civil rights, but we still want our human rights. So that's sort of what was going on, and why they had initiated this riot. But how do you manage a riot with over 500 inmates? And this is what ended up happening over the next 3 nights. That the prisoners, they formed a prisoners committee of Billy Knight and his colleagues, and they asked for a citizens committee to come into the prison to speak with them and to meet with them, because they didn't trust the prison administration. So 5 gentlemen and 5 lawyers from Toronto and a newsman named Ron Haggart came to the prison and sat down and had many hours of negotiations with the inmates and talked to them. And then the Citizens Committee had to then feed that back to the government. But of course, there was a massive communication breakdown. What was happening inside the prison was not what was going on outside the prison with respect to the politicians and the administrators. So as the hours ticked by, the conditions inside the prison are obviously very, very difficult. For the first day, they had no food, they had no coffee. The prison was completely destroyed, and that obviously ended up having serious implications as men, sat in this destroyed, cold prison over the next few days. So alliances then were created, and Billy Knight, who had instigated this riot, I don't think really thought about how he was going to manage these 500 plus inmates who were getting more frustrated and angrier as the days and the hours went on. So we've talked about a little bit about some of these things, what started the riot. So as I mentioned, very poor living conditions and overcrowding, the lack of basic human rights that were at play at the time, extreme isolation. Inmates at the time would spend upwards of 16 hours in their prison cells. So as I talk about in the book, during the 1950s, there was a number of programs in Canadian prisons. There was, and at KP, there was a baseball team, and there was a musical group, and there was a band. And then all of these programs slowly went away. So by the early 1970s, you've got hundreds of men basically sitting around doing very, very little, getting angry, getting frustrated. Very few programs, rehabilitation programs and education programs and work programs. And that's going to have a huge impact on what's going on in that prison when you've got many, many idle hands. Also, harsh punishments. So what the inmates talked about at the time was that if they lived on ranges, and if one person on that range created an incident or a situation, then the whole range would be locked down. So, or a whole group would be put into solitary confinement. Solitary confinement was 23.5 hours a day in the hole with virtually no human contact. And then, as I mentioned, was the transfer to the super maximum prison called Millhaven. Millhaven was the first of this of a new brand of penitentiary that the government had decided that they were going to build. It was there was a lot of opposition about the building of this super maximum. I called it a cement octopus. And it was built, I believe it was 3 years behind schedule, but it was the first of its kind. And as we know, it's still open today. So what did the prisoners want? Yes, they wanted to say, come take a look inside and see how we are being treated and how we are forgotten. Decent living conditions. So one of the things I mentioned here, names versus numbers. At the time, and you'll see in this photograph, the man at the very end of the table, that's actually Billy Knight, and he still has his prison uniform on. So at the time, uniforms were that kind of typical uniform that we see on television programs about prisons, where they still had the number. So the inmates were not referred to, they were referred to by their number versus their name. So again, that was just a very small thing that they were asking to be changed. As I mentioned before, when somebody is sent to prison, yes, their civil rights are taken away, but human rights do not and should not stop at the prison door. And this is what they were asking for. And other more programs, because as I mentioned, they were bored sitting in these very small isolated cells. So they needed more programming, more rehabilitation, more education, and these are the things that they were asking for at the time. So what did the prisoners get? The government was not willing to negotiate. There was much back and forth. As I mentioned, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau, our first Trudeau, was on his honeymoon at the time. So he was not involved in the negotiations, but the Solicitor General, Jean-Pierre Goyer, was in charge of the negotiations with respect to from Ottawa. And what was going back and forth, as they actually, I mean, they had no riot contingency, they had no riot plan when this happened. So there was too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. You had the prison administration, and then you had all these various layers of administration, and then of course going up to Ottawa. So what was being said during those committee meetings, while the Citizens Committee was trying to negotiate with the prisoners, what was being said to them was not what was happening on the outside. The government and Jean-Pierre Goyer said, and went on radio at the time and said, we will not negotiate with prisoners. And the prisoners had radios in their cells, and they heard this, and this is what caused the eventual complete destruction as to what happened in the prison. So yes, total destruction of the prison. I don't know if there was any part that was not destroyed. The prison chapels were destroyed. The dome was destroyed. All of the cells were destroyed, including like even the locking mechanisms were just torn from the walls. So it was an absolute disaster. And then, of course, when I talked about the reading that I did was where we have a complete breakdown of control, resulting in torture and murder. So a very small rogue group of inmates thinking that they were all going to be killed, hearing that the government was not going to negotiate, and seeing over 500 heavily armed soldiers on the outside of the prison. They said, you know what, what the hell, we're gonna do what we want to do. And of course there is a hierarchy in the prison system, and they decided that they were going to go for what they called the undesirables, that had been protected, were being guarded at different points during the riot, but this group of inmates decided that they were going to, let out their rage on the weakest inmates. So there is the very very difficult scene of torture and ultimate murder that happens on the last night of the riot. When the riot was finally quelled and the inmates came out of the prison, the transfer out happened. So inmates were put on buses and sent to Millhaven. And one of the last negotiation points that the inmates had tried to get the government to agree to was with respect to retaliation and reprisals, because they knew that if they gave up and they walked out, that there were going to be reprisals. And sadly, the men on the Citizens Committee, they didn't really understand this. So they said, yes, no, we'll guarantee your safety. You're going to be fine. We're going to get you safely on the buses and shipped out to different prisons. But mostly they were sent to Millhaven. So what happened when they went to Millhaven is that there were a group of very angry guards waiting for them. And the prisoners were taken off the bus, shackled, and sent down what was called a gauntlet. And they were beaten as they went through this gauntlet. So there were very serious reprisals. And what happened after that is the inmates were able to get the information out that they had been beaten, and ultimately 13 guards were charged with assaulting inmates, which was the first time that had ever happened in Canada, but none of them were actually convicted of assault. And then, of course, what ultimately ended up happening were very few penal reforms. There was a commission that was created to investigate the causes of the riot. It was called the Swackhammer Report. And when it came out, it certainly had many, many different suggestions and ideas regarding reform, and some were implemented. For example, they actually did take the numbers off of the prisoners' uniforms. And there was they created a new federal position called the Office of the Federal Ombudsman, which was designated and created to hear prisoners' complaints. So, and that position is still in place today. But, as I mentioned before, it was, things would happen for a little while, and then they would eventually kind of fall back into a different pattern. So as reforms would happen, then potentially you would get a new government that would come in place. A conservative government under Stephen Harper certainly had a very different opinion with respect to penal reform, and their whole mandate was to be tough on crime. So any particular potential reforms that had happened were then repealed and taken away. So, and this is what's happened for over many years in Canada. So I wanted to talk a little. So I wanted to talk a little bit, obviously, about the story and what happened. But then I also wanted to talk a little bit about the actual writing of this book. This is my first book, and so it was a wonderful, incredible experience, but not without its challenges. And the biggest challenge is how do you tell a story that nobody really wants you to tell? And I talk in the introduction of the book about going into this very naively. At the time, it was, 44, 45 years past the riot. I started in 2016. So I thought, I think I found a really great story that a lot of Canadians haven't heard about. And how can we tell this story and get it out to a wider audience? But of course, I was met with, in many closed doors. Nobody really wanted to talk about this story. So again, I wanted to just mention who the characters were in this story, who were the good guys and the bad guys. And what I discovered as I was writing is that they weren't necessarily who I thought they were going to be. So we have many different characters at play. And, one of the greatest heroes of this story is an inmate by the name of Barry Mackenzie, who took over the negotiations in those late night committee meetings, and basically um, saved the situation from becoming an Attica, where 39 people, including 9 guards, were killed. So as I said, it was very interesting to find out that who I thought were the good guys and the bad guys were not necessarily what I thought going into the story. So what happened for me is this is who I became. This is what I called myself. I became the accidental journalist, because I don't have a journalism background, and I thought, how am I going to tell this story? So I thought, okay, I've got to go into the belly of the beast, and drove up to Kingston, and went to the prison, went on my first tour. I had never been in the prison before, and then of course contacted Correctional Services of Canada and said, hey, I'm here, and I want to tell this story. And they said, no, we don't want to talk about that story. So as I said, I had to make a decision early on if I was going to keep going and keep digging, because this dig, I realized, was going to be very cumbersome, and it was going to take a great deal of time and patience, because there was a lot of no's happening right away. So the first thing that I decided that I needed to do, and felt compelled to do, was I had to find out if anybody was still alive who had experienced this. That was the very first thing that I had to do, because they are the witnesses to this riot from 50 years ago. Sadly, there were few people still alive, but this photograph that I put on this slide, that is one of the guards that was kidnapped. His name is Kerry Bichelle, and that is his wife, Elaine. And I sent a letter. Kerry Bichelle is the only guard that is still living out of the 6 that were kidnapped. So I sent a letter to him and said, this is what I'm doing. This is the book I want to write. And will you talk about this with me? And so he responded, and we ended up spending many hours together talking about what he had experienced. And also, when you go into a story like this, and you are, I felt responsible for dredging up those very difficult memories. So that certainly has to be done with care. And without Kerry talking to me and being open about discussing these very difficult memories for him, this would have been a much harder book to write. The other thing that I had to decide was what story did I want to tell? Again, going back to who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, and why ultimately do I want to tell this story? And what I discovered early on in my research was that, again, there was so many people that came together during those 4 days, and for the most part, many of them were were trying to resolve this without bloodshed. And so I really wanted to tell their stories and how inmates and lawyers and newsmen and prison administrators and so many people came together to try to resolve this peacefully. But also, I was up against the, this is a story about inmates and a riot and murder. So of course, who cares about this story? And what I needed to understand was how could I relay this story and hopefully encourage people to care about what's going on in our prisons. And what I discovered was that what's going on and what was going on in 1971 in our prisons is not actually that different from what is happening now. And that was certainly eye-opening for me. And that became the genesis of why I wanted to tell this story and why I thought it was still very, very important to tell today. And I've got a quote on there because this is certainly, again, the core of, I think, what I wanted to talk about, which is a prison sentence is a punishment for a crime, not an opportunity for further abuse. So, lessons learned from a riot 50 years ago. Very little has changed in our prisons in 50 years. Recently, if you've noticed in the last couple of years, we've been talking about solitary confinement. And I was shocked when I first learned that 50 years ago, inmates would be thrown in the hole for 23 and a half hours a day. And there was no potential time limit as to how long they could be left in that unit. Absolutely shocked when I found out that that hadn't changed. And as you know, the current government has changed solitary confinement, but that is something we are still definitely working on. And I get daily news from other people that I've met along the way about very disturbing things that are still happening in our prisons. Of course, in my second comment there, warehousing does not work. We can't put people in prison and just leave them there to sit. There has to be rehabilitation. So this is one of the other points that I definitely wanted to talk about, which is Corrections Canada remains a very inflexible bureaucracy with little external oversight. So as I mentioned in the book, we're still not basically able to get inside to see what's going on. So a lot happens without anybody externally having the ability to observe what is happening, and that remains a huge problem. There was some information, with respect to the COVID currently in our prisons. There was some information that came out about that, but again, that's very carefully monitored. So we still don't know a lot about what's going on. The other thing that I learned, which was, a very important lesson too, is that many of those incarcerated are victims themselves. Some of the inmates that I spoke to from 1971, I would say almost all of them were victims of abuse themselves, and again had been, through the whole foster care and group home situation, and then had just graduated up to a federal penitentiary. And if we look at who is in our prisons right now, there is obviously a very large number of inmates that suffer from mental health issues. There is a disproportionate number of Indigenous inmates in our institutions. So we have to really understand who is there, and think about that before we make judgments. And what is the ultimate goal of our correctional system, revolving door, or contributing members of society? So as I was writing and researching this book, and when I would come up against that sort of who cares, let's lock them up and throw away the key attitude, the one thing that I always would talk about is that I would say approximately 98% of our federal inmates, and of course provincial too, but federal inmates, they come back out of prison. So who do we want coming out of our prisons? Do we want somebody who's basically learned to become an even better criminal while they've been inside, or do we want contributing members of society? So that is definitely a question that we have to ask ourselves as a society. And I just want to mention that image that I have on this slide, that's a photograph that I took when I did a tour of the prison, and one of the inmates had written that on the wall because the prison was going to be closed in 2013. So lessons learned from writing a historical nonfiction book. As I mentioned, this has been my first foray into this genre. So I would say you certainly have to have passion, because you're going to be with whatever your subject is, whatever your book is about, you're going to be with it for a long time. This is not a short exercise. And this has been 5 years of my life. I know other people that have spent 10 years writing a nonfiction book. So you really have to decide early on if this is the topic is something that you're really passionate about. And of course, part of that is time. It is going to take a great deal of time, and if you are delving into something, a topic that people don't want to talk about, or that it's difficult to find information, you really have to decide that it's good. You're in it for the long haul, and a commitment to getting the truth. And that's certainly what I came up against, because there were many different competing stories about what happened on those 4 days of this riot. And people's memories are fallible. So you have to, and I had to learn how to kind of wade through what people remembered, what the truth was, and then again decide how I was going to be able to tell that story with I think my biggest commitment being to those people who had experienced it and lived through it. And I really wanted to make sure that I told their truth and the truth about what they experienced. So thank you, and I hope you have some great questions. And this is just an image of the dome after the riot. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. If we do have any questions, people, if you can please raise your hands using the reactions, or pop it in the Q&A, and then we can get those to Catherine. Shira says, thank you for the talk. It was great, very interesting and informative. Thanks, Shira, good feedback. Catherine, I'll ask a quick question if no one else is going to. Do you see any future progress? I know you said that right now it doesn't look like there's too much reform coming. Do you see an appetite for that? Does it seem to be something that's getting attention? I know we've just been through an election. I don't remember hearing much about it.
No, it was,
Is there anyone pushing for this, I guess, is my question.
yeah, I think penal reform is probably the last on the agenda of our politicians. Yeah, yes, because I think there's some very strong individuals that are pushing for reform, and they're not going to let up. They're a small yet mighty group. In the last couple of years, the BC Civil Liberties Association and the Ontario Civil Liberties Association both sued the federal government in and around the issue related to solitary confinement. So yes, I do believe there is progress, but it really takes a strong vocal group to keep that on the front page for sure.
Fantastic. I am seeing a couple more questions come through. We have one from Sue. She says, thank you, really enjoyed the book. What do you know about the living units that were created after the riot?
The living units, those related back to, again, conditions in the prison. And at the time of the riot, there were people couldn't have visitors. I mean, again, it was very basic. People, the relatives and friends would come in. I believe it was up to 2 times a month, if that. So after the riot, with respect to, different progress that was being made, they created the living units. They have some of those at Kingston Penitentiary that you can visit. So these were like small independent, like trailers, little homes that were created. So if you had a family member or, your wife or children, then you could go and have a visit with them. So I think that was a very, very progressive move, and very important for inmates that are so isolated. It's important for them to be able to spend time with their family. But as I mentioned, it's very interesting to do the tour and to see those units that they still have on site.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question from Harriet. Harriet asks, what is your impression of societies helping inmates like John Howard?
Well, I talk about John Howard in the book, and thank goodness we have John Howard and the Elizabeth Fry associations, because they have worked for years and years to help inmates. Because, as I said, most inmates come out of prison. So without organizations like that are helping inmates reintegrate into society, where would they be? I mean, if, where do I get a job? Where do I find clothing? How do I find housing? As we know, housing right now for anybody is extremely difficult, let alone somebody coming out of a penitentiary. So I'm very, very grateful for those kind of organizations. There's actually one just down the street from me in Toronto, and they have done excellent work. It was, the John Howard Society, they were one of the opponents of these supermax prisons that were being built back in the late 60s. So they have, thank goodness we have those organizations and those people.
Fantastic. We have a question from Dorothy Ann. She said she loved the book. So well balanced and fascinating. I'm finding some challenges gathering information about another institution in Kingston. Wondering how you managed to start inserting yourself. I'm looking into the WW2 TB Sanitarium, and it seems to exist nowhere in history.
Well, as I mentioned, I got in the car and drove up to Kingston, and I used multiple archives. I went to I remember going to the Kingston Library and speaking to some of the librarians there. The Ontario Archives certainly is a good resource. The other thing that I did, I'm actually talking about researching the book tomorrow in another session. But one of the best things that I did was I hired a researcher up in Ottawa, who was able to mine the archives in Ottawa. I'm not an archivist. Honestly, I actually had never been to archives before I started this book. So I did not know how to find information. But if you go to the Ontario Archives or the Library Archives Canada, they actually have a list of people that you can hire. And I have to say it was extremely money well spent, because that gentleman was able to find so much that I would have never ever been able to uncover. So, but yeah, you have to keep knocking on doors, even when they don't want to open them.
Knock louder.
Yes.
I have a question. Was the prison closed after the riot? That's another question.
No, it was not closed at the time, which is really interesting. Kingston Pen went through a few of these different transitions. It actually they changed it into the reception center for Ontario. So after the riot, there was they started determining who would be put into minimum and maximum, those kind of units. So the Kingston Pen became the reception center where many inmates would be sent, and they would spend time there, and then they would determine, what kind of classification they should be sent to, and then they were possibly sent out to other prisons like Collins Bay or Millhaven. But it still remained an active prison until 2013.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question from Shira. I'm interested in learning more about inmates' perspectives of rehabilitation and programs they were interested in having. For example, what would prison look like if there were more programs for healing or cultural perspectives, for example, Indigenous?
Mm-hmm. If you want to find out more information about that, you could definitely contact. There is information online, but there are organizations that work with Indigenous inmates, particularly out in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. There are healing lodges. There was a healing circle created at Kingston Penitentiary. I don't know what year that was created, but there are, I have actually seen images of it, and they actually still have part of it on the grounds. So there are organizations, as I said, that are working specifically with Indigenous inmates that I would definitely suggest that you speak with.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any more questions. I'm just going to check and see if anybody has a raised hand here. I don't see any.
Okay.
I guess last chance for questions. If you have any questions for Catherine, now's your chance. All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. That was fascinating.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I will do my final goodbyes. Oh, actually, just let me double check my chat. Not sure if Jennifer's still here. Thank you. Perfect, right on time. So thank you so much, Catherine. That was great. I do want to congratulate the winner of Murder on the Inside, and the winner is Lisa Fippen. I hope I'm saying that right. So congratulations, Lisa, on winning that book. A final reminder to visit our official bookseller, which is Novel Idea. They have copies of Catherine's book available to buy. You can grab them by phone or online if you can't get there in person. And if you are joining from outside of Kingston, do please consider supporting all the authors in the festival. And if you do have one, a local independent bookstore. We do love to support our independent bookstores. And a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today at Writers Fest. Please check out writersfest.ca for the rest of our great lineup, and we hope we get to see you at some of our other exciting events. And thank you again, Catherine. That was great.
Thank you.